Breaking news now involving Quincy Promes. He's been jailed for 6 years.
Kilo cocaïne, een straatwaarde van 20 miljoen.
Involvement in a drug smuggling ring.
Je moet eigenlijk gewoon beseffen dat jij een gezegend mens bent. Dat je van je hobby boek kan maken, tegen de bal aantrappen.
Ja, drugshandel, drugssmokkel hebben we gezien. Dus als de grote hoeveelheden ook, dus dan kan je zo'n straf wel verwachten.
It's a normal evening in Amsterdam and Quincy Promes is on a phone call with who it appears to be his father. Sometime during the phone call, Promes admits to his father a crime he committed, which you'd think wouldn't be a big deal. Or yes, he just admitted to committing a crime, but it was said on a private phone call with his father, so there shouldn't really be any problems, which would be true if his phone calls weren't being recorded. You see, the Dutch police had a warrant to listen to Promes' phone calls, essentially giving them permission to eavesdrop all his calls and messages. Specifically, the police brought evidence to the Amsterdam court, enabling them to further the investigation by spying on Promes, which would have otherwise been illegal without the court's permission. The evidence in question consisted of events that took place in Abkede, a town outside of Amsterdam. The exact events that took place aren't specified, but we could imagine it was towards the end of a party, where people were cleaning up and starting to go home. According to Promes' cousin, he was suddenly confronted by Promes, in which a tussle ensued, leading to Promes stabbing his cousin. The motive behind Promes' actions are completely unknown, but by mentioning these events to his father on a phone call, the police were now able to use this phone call recording to detain Promes. Despite being detained by the police for 2 days, he denied all these allegations, claiming they weren't true, which then meant he was released shortly after. Although Promes was released, this didn't mean the case was dropped. The police simply went away for a year to build a stronger case against Promes. Now, this case had many delays in it due to occurring during the pandemic, but by 2021, nearly a year later, the prosecutors announced that Promes should be officially prosecuted with attempted murder, which would mean 12 to 15 years in prison, with the court date also being set another 2 years later in 2023. The date arrived and Promes didn't make an appearance in court, and in the picture above you can see how there's a drawing of the court session that took place. Specifically, how there's 2 empty seats, one of which is Promes's. But the Dutch police couldn't do anything about it. You see, during this time Promes was playing for Spartak Moscow, a football club in Russia, and because he lived in Russia, the Netherlands weren't able to just bring him back, as they don't have an extradition agreement with Russia. Essentially, the two countries don't have the agreement of being able to ask the other to return a person in order to stand trial or to serve a sentence, meaning as long as Promes does not leave Russia or go to any other country that has an extradition agreement with the Netherlands, he was essentially safe. Nearly a week later, after Promes' absence in court, it was reported that there had been a halt in Promes' trial due to the legality of one of the pieces of evidence used by the prosecutors, specifically the phone call recording they had of Promes mentioning his role in the stabbing. You see, despite having a solid piece of evidence, the way in which the evidence was retrieved was problematic. Now, it wasn't the way it was conducted. The police tapping another person's phone is allowed as long as you have a warrant, in which the Dutch police did have. Remember when I told you? For the police to spy on its own citizens, they need permission by a court, and they gain this permission by submitting evidence that they have a lead. Now, this evidence had nothing related to Promes stabbing his cousin. It was actually due to something much more worse. This is extremely important, as for the evidence to hold up in court, it has to be collected legally. If the police get a warrant for one crime but find evidence for another without proper permission, that evidence is considered fruit of the poisonous tree, which is basically a legal term to say the evidence is tainted and unusable because the law wasn't followed. Even if it's incriminating, it can't be used against someone. Now, for Promes, this meant that the value of one of the key pieces of evidence, being the phone call recording, had been reduced significantly, which meant that the prosecutors were now only able to charge Promes for the alleged stabbing with aggravated assault, which meant he was now officially charged with having to only serve 18 months. But this wasn't necessarily a let-off for Quincy Promes. The police announced they had completed a separate criminal case on Quincy Promes, the criminal case that originally gave the police permission to spy on Promes, being his involvement in a drug trafficking ring. In the phone tapping, it showed that Promes was involved in a shipment of drugs, specifically a ton of cocaine, hidden as salt. The Dutch government then officially announced that Promes was to face 6 years in prison on top of his 18 months of aggravated assault. But as I stated, the same issue loomed. Promes was still in Russia, and the Netherlands don't have an extradition agreement with Russia, meaning they couldn't just bring him back. So what they did was put Promes on an international wanted list, putting him on red notice, essentially an alert to any other country that has an extradition agreement to detain Promes. It's still February 2024 and his club Spartak Moscow was due to play Zenit St. Petersburg, a very important game as these were two of the biggest teams in Russia. To properly prepare for this match, the club decided on having a mid-season camp held in the UAE, which meant that the club and players, including Quincy Promes, were of course living in Dubai for a couple days, training and preparing for the next game. It was now February 29th and the date was set for Spartak Moscow to return to Russia. While at the hallmarked airport, Promes was detained for suspicion of leaving a scene for a traffic incident, so the club had to leave without him. Despite being released the following day, he had to remain in the country until his court date for this traffic incident on the 12th of March. The day came and Promes was only fined for a crime, which then meant he was released shortly after. But if you couldn't tell, this whole arrest and putting Promes in custody was all for the actual bigger reason of the Netherlands being able to extradite Quincy Promes. The UAE and the Netherlands have an extradition agreement, and with Quincy Promes being on the international wanted list, it was only a matter of time before he was sent back to the Netherlands to serve his sentence. So the very same day he was released for his minor traffic incident, he was arrested again as the Netherlands now officially sent in their extradition request. The problem arises with the fact that extradition is an extremely lengthy process, which could take a couple years. A separate independent judge in Dubai needs to consider the Dutch's request before extraditing Quincy Promes. In addition to this, Promes and his lawyers are still appealing both cases of Promes allegedly stabbing his cousin and importing cocaine. Therefore, according to Promes' lawyer, the judgment of the Amsterdam court is not final, as they need to completely reassess the alleged role of Promes in this case. As of right now, Promes is still living in Dubai, and in the meantime he decided to sign for a club in the UAE First Division called Dubai United.
I'm getting paid to learn how to run a business. Rather do things when I want and how I want and get paid more at some office job and eat shit. That ain't what I'm after.